Howdy, all you delicious people! I'm here today to review review the movie Nobody. So, in all actuality, this movie has a early release thing that you could see on an Amazon or so on and so forth. I would just say go out of your way to go into some kind of movie pro or some kind of movie app of sorts and watch this for free. Honestly, this is kind of a very familiar concept with this movie, and it's a very kind of familiar movie. We have it to where there isn't much within this movie that kind of makes this story unique at any point in time. Um, I kind of like the fact that we end up having Hutch Mansell have a father, of course, an actor that we're very familiar with, Christopher Lloyd, of course, from Back to the Future. We end up having a movie that is like, I would say overall this movie is fun. It's just nothing that really, like, as far as story goes, like grabs me and says like, man, I needed to have spent 20 some odd dollars to go into the theater or go into Amazon or go into wherever to see this early. uh, so luckily enough, I was able to watch this for absolutely free. Because this movie, there are some interesting action sequences into it, uh, but it also feels very much also like very familiar territory. Like to me, like it this looks like a fusion of, like, I would say, like Jason Statham's Transporter movie, the original one, and like a mixture of that, and probably a lot of people would forcibly say John Wick. Uh, but really looking at it, like, John Wick was by himself. He didn't have a family throughout the entire movie, but it is what it is. A lot of people could make, like, if Invincible was a live action movie, it would probably be kind of like Invincible as well. It seems that we don't really have much of a backstory of Hutch's wife in this movie, and so, like, that's the thing that I was like, okay, how exactly did Hutch and Becca, like, how did they get together? Like, what was the flashbacking thing of that? Like, we could have had, but we didn't in this movie to really help it. Like, it seems that Hutch and Beck seem to have had uh, some backstory that was never really told within this movie, and I think there's a huge missed opportunity here where we could have really gone in and, like, there was a lot of stuff that was just completely and utterly just like skipped around about, because I guess this movie just didn't have time, and they were trying to implement backstory of certain characters, but it just didn't work out that way to have me just go, oh yeah, like, I really know these people now. No, there was so much mystery on a lot of characters in this movie, and reasonably, there was just too much focus, I think, on the main character and nothing else. We had it to where even the villain in this story, they set him up by having him speaking Russian dialogue through a bulk of this movie, uh, and eventually have us connect the hero with the villain in this story, because of course there's a formulaic, like, oh well, this guy killed the wrong guy. Like, a lot of this, yeah, like, will seem very much copy and paste of John Wick, and when looking at it, a lot of people would rather see John Wick than this movie, because John Wick would be easily able to be obtained, uh, besides this movie, which you'd have to go out of your way to find and whatever. Like, I'm sure John Wick is probably easily accessible through some easy app thing that you can go, oh yeah, I'm going to watch John Wick because it's on Prime right now, or something along those lines. Um, but, like, I wouldn't say that this movie is a complete bomb, a complete failure, a complete whatever. No, like, there's something good about this movie. I just didn't care about it enough to say that there is some good quality to this movie. Like, I think this kind of feels too generic of an action movie for me to really 100% give a stamp of approval if people need to go out of their way to see this film. Just because it gets to the point where every action movie has to kind of mimic and copy and whatever the most successful one. Um, and so that's what this movie does. But yeah, so I wouldn't say that this movie's bad. I just didn't care for it, to be brutally honest. Um, I'd watched like kind of some interesting Bob Odenkirk movies recently, but yeah, I just don't care for this film. It's not interesting enough for me, and plus it gives you no real like it. It tries to prevent giving any kind of backstory. You don't even understand what's going on through some of it, and so on and so forth. So that's all that I really have to say within this movie as a very cryptic like sense, and then we'll get into spoilers because it's just another action movie. It's just a uh, it's just another thing out there to see if you have nothing better to go and watch. So, with that said, let's go into spoilers about this movie. Let's go out of our way to say that uh, this movie is just okay. It's it's a generic action movie. Let's just say that. So, spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So, at the very beginning of it, we have a tour. We have a montage of Bob Odenkirk's Hutch going through his like day to day to day like white picket fence life, where he's consistently forgetting about the trash every single week. I would assess that the trash after some point in time would just really compile because he's forgotten it like 3 to 4 weeks, and so on and so forth. So we have Hutch, who seems to have a common day to day lifestyle, and that is to just showcase us that this guy is going through, like, this guy's like us. So we end up having it at some point early on in this movie where there are two burglars that end up trying to burglarize Hutch's home. And so we have it to where Hutch ends up hearing the burglars going through his house. And so we end up having seemingly Hutch grabbing a golf club that is eventually going to try to uh, go after one of these burglars. And we find that one of the burglars has a gun, and so we have it to where Hutch's son ends up jumping in and grabbing one of the thieves, and so the one female thief with the gun is to try and uh, stop the kid from jumping on top of uh, her accomplice, and we have it to where Hutch is almost tempted to go and slug the girl with the gun because it's almost going to kill his son. But we end up instead having Hutch stopping his son from choking out the burglar and let them go with whatever they want. Uh, it seems that the burglars asked for any kind of money that this guy has, and he's like, dude, all I have is credit cards. Like, there's not much you can get from me. To where they only grab his watch and I think some kind of bracelet. And so we have the thugs going off, and we have police being called, files being reported. The son goes to school the next day, and everybody's like, "Oh my god!" Like, yeah, he tried to stop burglars at his home. So we end up having everybody like calling basically Hutch like a wussy or whatever, because like, dude, like, you didn't do anything to like stop these burglars. It's like, couldn't you have tried something? And he's like, nah, they got away with little bits of whatever, but it wasn't really much of anything. Um, so we even have it to where Hutch works at his wife's father's company, and so we end up having Becca's brother giving Hutch a gun to say like, "Hey man, like you need to defend my home, or you need to defend your home because you need to protect my sister." And so we end up having Hutch taking this gun and putting it in some uh, food box or whatever in a freezer and just walks away. We have Eddie Williams, who is Michael Ironside, who is in this movie. That I'm like, man, like I love Michael Ironside, but uh, like I think he's just kind of doing whatever at this point. It's like, man, whatever job I can get, I'll just try to do. So we have it to where Eddie Williams is having this conversation with Hutch about buying this business, and we have Eddie Williams that's like, well, yeah, that's great and all, but I would love to have somebody who's really interested in buying this business for a bunch of money because I really like I want to really retire and whatever, and so Hutch really understands that, but eventually he'll come back to try to buy the building yet again, and then Eddie Williams will say, oh, "Okay, sure, like go ahead and take the company." So we end up having Hutch having this itch to go back uh, to being who he was. We end up having Hutch eventually talking to some guy on the radio that we end up finding out is Harry Mansell that ends up helping him out. Uh, I hope that's the right guy. Ends up helping him out later on in the film, but we have it to where Harry is talking to Hutch and is like asking what all had happened, and so we end up kind of finding out that eventually this guy seems to be some secret agent that it seems that Hutch is talking to through the radio, so on and so forth. So we end up having Hutch decide that he wants to go after the people that had taken from him. And so we, of course, had it to where Hutch mentions that he knew that the gun that that woman had was empty, um, but he was just going to let everything slide to let them go and take what little that they could have taken from him and been fine with it. But eventually he ends up realizing, you know what, like I actually think I want to get back what they took from me. So we have Hutch going through every tattoo parlor in town um, with a picture of a tattoo that he drew from memory. And so we have it to where somebody recognizes the tattoo and sends him off to where these burglars were. And so he ends up pulling a gun on them, and he ends up wanting his watch back and wanting the kitty cat bracelet that they had taken from him. And they bizarrely no longer have the bracelet, and so he ends up getting really, really angry and upset about, "Give me my kitty cat bracelet!" I'm gonna have to pause here for a second because the battery on here is dying soon. Okay, so we go along here and we have it to where Hutch has gotten back what has stolen from him, but now he just really just wants to just keep going on. He really just wants to beat the living crap out of somebody. And eventually we have Hutch going on this bus, and we have a group of drunken individuals all making their way onto this bus. and he's like, well, I think these are gonna have to be the guys. These are gonna have to be it. I hope they like hospital food. So we end up having a group of guys all harassing people on this bus. And so what we end up doing is we end up having Hutch taking and walking all the way up to the front of the bus to have the bus driver um, going into the outside of the bus, and then Hutch the ends up closing uh, the bus, of course, door. So here's one thing. So we end up having it to where at some point I think Hutch really wanted to like get his stuff back, and so we end up having it to where Hutch ends up seeing Christopher Lloyd, who is David, uh, and so Hutch ends up taking his father's FBI badge and ends up kind of taking some of his clothes, because he's like, yeah, like I'm gonna go back to like being me again. To his father's like, well, okay, I'll see you later. So we end up having Hutch now on this bus, and so we of course have this big fight out. We end up having like some of the guys wheeled out knives. Hutch ends up like disarming them, stabbing them. Uh, we eventually have it to where Hutch leads off with having a full gun with bullets that he ends up taking he dumps all the bullets out, and he says like hey, let's get started. And so we end up having it to where eventually somebody grabs the gun and starts putting bullets back into it, and we end up having Hutch, who now had like torn off like a pipe or something from this bus, and it hits this guy with it. I'm like, dude, like that was kind of dumb for you to have the gun and toss it off to the side, because legitimately like someone was going to scramble for that and someone could have shot you and you could have died. Eventually, we have it to where we end up finding Hutch outside of this bus because he ends up getting thrown through one of the windows, and we have Hutch getting back up and going back and beating the crap out of these guys more to the point to where like some of them end up almost dying. We eventually have it to where Hutch eventually has to put a straw through one guy's throat so he can continue breathing, and so on and so forth. Like that's how bad he beats these guys up. So we now go to a separate story of this guy named Yelane. Yelane Kuznetsov, whatever. We end up finding out that Yelane, one of the guys on this bus was actually his brother, and we are to find out that his brother Teddy is to die in this hospital. So Yelane is a guy that is some kind of club owner where he does karaoke and he sings with some girl, and we end up having it to where Yelane ends up going to his I guess his bosses, and they are kind of telling him, it's like, well, hey man, like it seems like you've gone kind of soft. It's like, I don't know if we can really trust you with you singing and dancing every night. And so we end up having it to where Elaine is having to earn his stripes. And so one guy that had looked at him funny, uh, we end up having Elaine like break off this wine bottle and like just cutting this guy up. And so we have it to where Elaine is just like, well, have I earned your trust again? And they're like, hey man, do you even know who you killed? And he's like, dude, I don't even care. And so pushing on. So we have it to where Elaine now wants to uh, find Hutch to go and kill him. And so we end up having it to where Hutch is trying to, after he's been brutally beat up, he's trying to win back his family. He's trying to, like, he's going to his wife after she's, like, bandaged and, uh, like, super glued his body because, to try to cover up his wounds. And so we end up having Hutch saying, like, you know what, like, it's been a long time, Becca, since we've like made love or kissed or hugged or anything. Like it's been so long, and like Becca really has no answer for that. But we have it to where Hutch is making food for his family, making a dinner, and so on and so forth. And so we end up having it to where while they are eating, we end up having Hutch noticing there's some vehicles that are seemingly being parked by his house, and so we have Hutch telling everybody to go to the basement, to where he ends up having to fight every single one of these guys, all in his house, John Wick style, of course. And so we end up having, of course, him taking down every single person, and so now we end up having Hutch uh, try to get information from these guys, and of course he gets that information. So we have a guy named the Barber who is to give, um, who is to have Hutch come to see him, because evidently the barber was a guy that Hutch used to see for all kinds of wet work and whatever. And so we end up having the barber giving Hutch the the jacket of this Elaine guy, and we have it to where Hutch is like, dude, like, am I that obvious that I would probably just go after this guy? And it's like, well, hey, he's looking for you, so it's either you or him, so pick and choose. So so what ends up happening here is we have straight up we have Hutch's character going to the club of where Elaine is at, and while he's singing or whatever, and so we have it to where Elaine goes right to Hutch and is like, "Well, hey, like why is it that you're here?" And he's like, "Well, I just came here for the atmosphere. I just came here for a good meal." And we end up having Hutch like unsheath that he has like a bomb strapped to him at a just like a flip of the wrist. This bomb will go off, and so like do not mess with him. So we end up having it to where Hutch ends up having to like fight his way through this club, and so eventually we end up having it to where Hutch goes on to realize that like he's going to have a ton of men that are going to come after him, and so we end up having it to where Hutch decides uh, to buy off Eddie Williams' company and change the entire environment to be very tactical, to where he ends up creating all these kinds of bombs that will go off and all these kinds of little weaponry like things that he can like unlock and unsheath and whatever, to where these guys are going to come after him. So while that is also going on, we have Harry Mansell and also Hutch's father saying like, "Well, hey, I'm going to help you out," because we have it to where Christopher Lloyd's character is mentioning that he misses the action and that he wants to go and help out his son, and so we we end up having it to where eventually uh, Hutch goes through here uh, and takes down all of these men with all these like booby traps that he has, to where eventually we end up having Hutch wanting to burn down every single little bit of anything that Elaine has, to the point where uh, like any little thing that has any drug money or anything like that, Hutch burns all down, all kinds of things, to eventually go and kill Elaine, and like this basically resolves anything. To where we end up seeing 3 months down the road that Hutch is getting a new home, and then is eventually getting a call, that he is to be on to another job. So yeah, really like really just kind of an interesting movie, but very easily a skippable movie as well. Because I kind of just rushed through this review. With that said, yeah, Nobody to me was like it was kind of interesting to where the daughter of this family was asking for a cat, and so Hutch ends up going through an interrogation with these police officers, and uh, he ends up going through this interrogation while feeding a cat, and they're basically asking him like, "Who are you?" And he's like, "I'm nobody." Uh, and so really they couldn't pin anything on him, so they didn't really and truly arrest him. Um, but that's kind of how this movie starts with Hutch going into this interrogation where he's feeding some cat, and they're asking who he is, and it's like, well, nobody. Um, but yeah, so with that said, this movie, I don't know, like it could hit people a lot of different ways. Eventually, I would just rather quickly have seen this gone into some streaming service somewhere, like a Prime or whatever, um, because I don't know if it's really theater worthy. But I don't think anything is really quite theater worthy right now. So that's kind of really just telling where the bar isn't set right now. Because everybody's just kind of chucking anything out there to see if it makes money. Um, because they just kind of have to take a hit with something. So with that said, I am going to get out of here because I quickly rushed through the ending of the movie, and I didn't marinate on it, but I kind of went through a lot of detail with a lot of other stuff. So with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.